So now is the workshop on a set of 5 policies that address our relationship with law enforcement. And it looks like Mr. Townsend is going to introduce this workshop and walk us through the 5 policies. So thank you so much, Mr. Townsend.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening again, board and members of the public. I'm very excited to be here tonight to bring this set of policies forward for your consideration after more than a year of work with the policy committee. Our goals for tonight's workshop include developing a shared understanding of why and how we've reviewed these policies, in addition to communicating the proposed changes for the policies you have in front of you tonight. As a reminder, as you're familiar, the language of our Portland Promise Equity Goal calls on us to review current practices and policies that create unintended barriers to access and work to dismantle them. The issues related to law enforcement in our schools was discussed throughout the 2019-2020 school year, culminating in the board voting to not renew the contract with the Portland Police Department to have our 2 school resource officers at our large comprehensive high schools. At the time this decision was made, the board also committed to reviewing a set of policies that involved law enforcement to ensure they are aligned with our overall vision and priorities, and to ensure that we are not creating unintended barriers to student success. Tonight's presentation is the first set of policies that the policy committee has worked through to address these issues. As we have reviewed previously, we're aware of the substantive research that has documented the overrepresentation of students of color, students who are English language learners, and students who are economically disadvantaged in school discipline. Additionally, this research indicates that a consequence of students experiencing school discipline makes it more likely that a student will be engaged with the juvenile justice system, which leads as well to worse life outcomes. Given the overrepresentation of different marginalized groups in school discipline, these students have a much greater chance of interacting with law enforcement as a result. And as we've seen, this data is not data from somewhere else. We are confronting the issues around discipline disparity and overrepresentation of students who are economically disadvantaged, our English learners, students who have IEPs in our own district. So this is an issue that lives here within our community. Additionally, just to provide a little more context, a recent study in the state of Texas indicated that students were nearly 3 times more likely to be in contact with the juvenile justice system for a suspension or expulsion for a discretionary reason. It is this type of data and research that informs these proposed revisions to our policies to provide clear guidance to our staff about how we engage law enforcement in student matters. To inform this process, we have been engaged in substantive community engagement over the past year to inform the policy committee's revisions and recommendations. In late February of this past year, we hosted a community dialogue that brought together over 75 community stakeholders, students, parents, staff, and community partners to talk about establishing safe schools and our relationship with the police department. Additionally, we have engaged with a number of other community groups along the way, sharing drafts of the policies and working from their feedback or recommendations. This engagement includes working with the Reimagine Education student cohort over the past 2 summers, sharing various drafts with our high school leadership team, getting feedback from the Portland Education Association, meeting with law enforcement leadership, including the Portland Police Department and from the juvenile justice system, and engaging other community partners, including the ACLU of Maine and leaders from the Opportunity Alliance. As well as always, we've been in close contact and appreciate the support of our legal counsel from Drummond Woodsum in this work as we seek to chart a path to be able to protect student interests through this work. So now I would like to walk through a little bit with an overview of the changes proposed in each of the policies that are on first read for tonight. So the first policy is the most substantive one and is to adopt a new policy, KLGB, Law Enforcement and Student Matters, to provide overarching guidance for staff in our interactions with law enforcement as it relates to students. This policy was informed from model policies from Drummond, as well as a model policy from the ACLU of Washington State. One of the main emphases of this policy is to clarify that school discipline is the sole responsibility of school staff and that law enforcement shall not be involved. This goes back to the research I just shared about how engaging law enforcement in discretionary student discipline matters can increase the likelihood of student involvement in the juvenile justice system, which is correlated with negative life outcomes for these students. This policy articulates guidance for school staff in requesting law enforcement assistance, depending on the threat to safety and seriousness of the incident. Additionally, it provides expectations for visits by law enforcement in limiting the circumstances when a student should be interviewed and confirming the supports that should be available to any student. The next policies that are in front of us for consideration.
Do we want to stop policy by policy and see if there's questions?
Sure.
Would that be okay? It's a lot of content.
It is a lot of content. I'm totally fine to do it whatever way is best for the board. I will say KLGB is the most substantive.
Yes.
There are some significant ones that fall in these couple of policies, and then the last set of policies is there, I would argue, are not particularly substantive changes.
Okay, if you want to go through them, that's fine.
Now, I think it probably makes sense for you to ask questions about KLG because it is the most substantive one. And then I do think that you can just run through the others because I don't think that those are that substantive.
Okay. Are there questions on this? I have a question, so I'll just jump in. Okay. This is a workshop. Under B, visits for law enforcement, visits by law enforcement agencies, I had a very specific question, which was basically, so this part says that law enforcement needs to provide written consent from the school, from a student's parents or parent or legal guardian prior to interviewing or questioning a student. And then under 2 provides options for when that law enforcement can interview students without that express permission from a parent or legal guardian. And I just want to, I was confused by the A, B, and C, and whether I see an or between A and B, but then wanted to just clarify that C is required in all cases. And I'm wondering if we might want to reformat it to just and to just make that clarification.
Sure.
It's super minor, and I'm sorry, but I had to read it several times to just make sure, okay, this is my understanding.
Yeah. Certainly C is expected, that would be required in any circumstance. So yes, we would want to make that clear so we can make a modification to that.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions on this policy? There's a lot here. Okay, we can come back to it, but let's move forward for now.
Okay, sorry, let me get back to my my Zoom presentation here. Okay. So jump ahead. Okay. So the next set of kind of policies for consideration. Sorry, I apologize. So based on the overall guidance from the proposed new policy KLGB, we've proposed revisions to other policies and procedures. So again, kind of KLGB positioned as an overarching policy and trying to then align this set of additional existing policies to be consistent with that. So for policy JRA, the Student Records and Information, and its related procedure, the committee proposes to eliminate the reference to a designated law enforcement unit. So historically, this has been the Portland Police Department designated as our as a formal term, as our designated law enforcement unit. Making this change means that we would have to have parental permission or to be compelled by court order to share information with law enforcement pursuant to the language in KLGB. And the other additional changes there are some language to be consistent with our gender neutral pronouns, but the primary changes to JRA and JRAR are eliminating that designation of the Portland Police Department as our designated law enforcement unit. Then for policy KI, another more substantive revision is removing the references to language about. So previously that section that Chair Figdor was just referencing was located in the visitor policy. And so in reviewing this and trying to be able to present the information clearly to staff, the recommendation had been to pull it out of the visitor policy and put it in the overarching new policy KLGB. There was also the recommendation of removing language from that existing policy regarding visits by officials from the Department of Health and Human Services and moving that language into the child abuse and neglect policy. So that's pending work for us at the policy committee. So that's the main, is removing that language. We have, based on kind of the deliberations by the committee, also added language because the KLGB, we've gotten clear, is really about law enforcement involvement in student matters. And so we did add some, limited language about authorizing staff for, contacting law enforcement in the event of disruptive visitors to campus and so forth, so that that there was guidance for them out there. And then based on those changes, council's guidance was to remove the legal references because those were no longer relevant to KI. And then just briefly, I'll speak to kind of both the bomb threats and security camera system policies and their related procedures, because there is not super substantive changes in those. So generally, these changes that you see in those proposed policies, have to do with updating some kind of language and organization for clarity. In the bomb threat policy and council suggested the removal of the procedure language from the policy and to rescind the administrative guidelines, again, just out of clarity for our policy book, so that that language would be embedded in our EBCA, the Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan. So all of that information would be in one place as opposed to multiple policies, to be able to find that guidance. But other than that, for the security camera system, just minor updates in terms of cross references and some minor language updates. So those are the policies in front of us now. We have a few, we did approve some changes in the discipline policies that had been called out, specifically the weapons, school violence, school safety policy. So those had already kind of were consistent and aligned, and we have two other policies that we're still working on that were part of the charge around law enforcement related policies. So JICH, which is the substance abuse policy, and then the questioning and searching of students policy. So those are two policies still kind of from the original list of policies that were identified back in June 2020 for us to review and evaluate. So we're working towards those and hope to be able to bring those back before the end of the board calendar this year.
Thank you so much, Mr. Townsend. There are questions on these policies for Mr. Townsend. Mr. Burke.
Thank you. As noted, I'm going to head back towards KLGB.
Yep.
I think I have two questions. The first one is I'm trying to understand in A and looking at 3 and 4, which is 2 clarifies when we may request assistance from law enforcement. 3 is when we should not request it. And then 4 just says it's not intended to prevent an individual from contacting law enforcement. So I'm just wondering how that all plays out.
So I could imagine, that this last part came up. So an individual here is not intended to mean a staff member, or I guess it could mean a staff member per se, but if, of their own volition outside of the context of how the school is pursuing the issue, that somebody has the right. So it's reaffirming an existing right for somebody to be able to pursue or press charges however they may choose to do so. And, wanting to make that clear. So.
Okay, that's helpful.
Can I just add to that? Came up in several of the conversations with stakeholders along the way where people, saw the changes that we were making and were concerned that we not be in a position where we're suggesting to people that they don't have a right to call the police. So I think that's the intent behind that fourth piece. I think the other two are very specifically like, these are the circumstances where you must, these are the circumstances that could occur that you shouldn't. And then the last piece is the, separate from all of that, if you personally have a reason we're not, as the board is not preventing people from, contacting the police.
That's
helpful. Thank you. And then
could I follow up on that before you move on?
Okay.
Is that all right?
Sure.
I had a question on that too. And so just to clarify, we're just, that we wouldn't, there's nothing that we can do to prevent someone from involving.
It was always implied, but people were concerned that we were being so forceful about you don't in these circumstances that it could be perceived as like nobody can. But obviously we couldn't prevent somebody from picking up the phone and calling 911.
So it's purely as reassurance that people can do what they want to do outside of school staff.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Mr. Burke, go ahead, please.
No problem. In B, and I'm sorry if this is somewhat repetitive to your Fig Doors question, but my question is, how much of this is like theoretical reorganizing of visits by law enforcement versus how much of it, if we look back in the past 5 years, would fundamentally alter interactions that occurred in our school buildings? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. I think, Superintendent, speak to this if you may. So much of this language, there are some slight modifications, but much of this language has been the existing policy. It's been embedded in the visitor policy. That being said, there have been instances, I don't think it was well known and well understood. We've had instances of student arrests happening on campus when they did not need to be, right? To some of the language here, right? It wasn't about an active police matter in the school. So there have been instances like that could have been prevented, and just a general lack of clarity on staff's part around a law enforcement officer shows up. Can I give him something? Can I not give him something? Right. And so it's, the gray area of how schools historically have ultimately become complicit in the administration of criminal justice, right? And so, just adopting the policy is certainly not the end of the work, right? But building, understanding about these, expectations and what the role of school staff is and kind of enforcing them. And certainly we've had productive conversations, with the police department and with juvenile justice around clarifying kind of process as it relates to this so that there's shared understanding on both sides. But I don't know if there are other examples you want to speak.
I think that's right on. Yeah.
And that's helpful. Thank you. And then if I lean into one thing you said in terms of the role of staff, when I was a homeless youth outreach worker at Preble Street, and if the police came to the drop-in center, we were directed to say, I cannot confirm or deny that person that you're looking for is here, but you are free to look around. Mm-hmm. Is there such a directive within our buildings in terms of a police officer comes to look for a student, what our staff are to say or not say or any of that nature?
Yeah, I would say not at the moment, right? We've been working through to clarify and land this policy, and I don't know that exact scenario would be replicable, but
sure.
That will certainly be part of kind of the implementation so that both, starting with leadership and then certainly with front office staff as well, they're clear of how to respond. if somebody comes in.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to prescribe that
Yeah. No,
directive.
I
I'm
I
just
mean, I think
using
what
it
this
as an example.
policy would direct us to do in those circumstances is to cooperate with law enforcement, but to hold them to the standards that are outlined here, which are, you can't talk to the student unless you have the permission, the parent's permission, or you can provide evidence that that you tried and that there's an imminent reason why you need to speak to the student at this time, and directs our staff to be with the student if those other conditions are met.
And so a question in there, who is educating that what the police is providing as evidence is sufficient and thus would provide access? Is that the principal or assistant principal?
That will be our responsibility.
The superintendents and assistant superintendents or administrators, you mean?
It will be our responsibility to provide that to the administrators.
No, I've gotten confused now. So if the police come and they say, I tried reaching the parents, I couldn't reach them, please let me meet with the student. Who is it? The secretary? Is it the principal? Is it you as a superintendent? Who's clearing the police officer to interact with the student at that point?
It's the principal that clears that to happen, or the assistant principal if the principal is not around.
Yeah.
And it's our responsibility to make sure that we have consistent understanding of what would be acceptable in those circumstances. And I think, to Aaron's point, much of this language has been in our policy, and it's either not well known or not consistently understood. And so I think that that's the recognition, and why it's moved from there into this KLGB policy is so that it has the prominence and the visibility that it did not have when it was in the, I'm pointing to it back here like it was there, it's not, in the visitors to the school policy, which had lots of other things in there as well. And then that was buried in the middle of it.
Okay. Thank you for taking me, even if that was a long way around the barn. I appreciate it.
Mr. Youssef.
Yeah, I just want to follow up what has been mentioned. So the visitation, when the law enforcement may interview a student, that doesn't include the probation officer, right?
That does include the probation officer, but that is moving to what policy is it moving to?
Well, the Department of Health and Human Services is moving to the child abuse and neglect policy.
But the JCCO is in this policy.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. So yeah, it changes the practice there, and that's part of the explicit conversation we've had with with the leadership of the Department of Corrections and the juvenile justice system. So we've met with Mr. Coyne and talked about this, and so they are actually working on some shared procedures so that we can, and protocols so we can share with staff. But it does eliminate what had been a somewhat common practice, is like performing their kind of supervision at school. So coming to school to meet with kids for routine supervision. So that's something that is, we've been clear with them thus far per the language in the policy, and moving forward is not a practice that would continue. That can happen. School is not the place for that work, right? There are other, means of collaboration and communication and information sharing, given a student, an individual's terms of release, that will collaborate with them around, right, to ideally support a student's development and success. But school is not the place for them to just administer it because it's convenient, right? That we want students to come to school and know they're coming to school to be safe and for what they're coming to school for.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Ms. Banjo. Thank you, Mr. Youssef.
I just need a little clarification on the prior to removing a child from school without express. I think that's the third.
Mm-hmm.
The third paragraph almost in the end. Yeah, even though we are strongly discouraged that, but if they have a court order, why they have to execute it, or what's going to happen to that scenario?
In terms of if they have, need to arrest somebody from they have a court order.
In our venue,
for some
in our
case of
school,
arrest.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if that, I guess I would say, I mean, if they have a court order that would likely qualify as the sufficient evidence, and it's an immediate health and safety thing, that would then be the appropriate. We would try and work with them to make that not a very visible thing, so there are ways to minimize the impact of that. But what we're trying to seek here, I guess, is that not just doing it because they know the kid will be at school, right? But that there needs to be a standard that's, a higher level than that in terms of, the immediate health and safety and the immediacy of needing to make that arrest that we would kind of try and want to hold them to.
Okay.
I mean, we've had, I guess, one example, right, in terms of how we're trying to move on this, of like just the custom, right? And this is, I think what this is designed to interrupt, where school isn't the place for policing, is we've had instances, even in my shorter tenure here, where, and this was through the context of probation, where a student was arrested at school because of violating terms of their probation. They weren't doing anything while they were at school, right? And there was no immediate health and safety issue. So this language seeks to kind of eliminate that kind of practice, but they just knew the kid was going to be at school, right? And caused a real breach of trust, between the student and the school, and, issues like that beyond, obviously the challenges the student was facing. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bondo and Mr. Townsend. So I don't see any other questions. I want to encourage the board, there's a lot of substance here, and to really familiarize yourself with the policies prior to our next meeting, when we'll have a further opportunity to ask questions and to discuss, to hear from the public and to discuss these before we vote on them. If there are changes that you are seeking to make, I think it would be very helpful for Mr. Rodriguez as the chair of the policy committee, myself, Mr. Townsend, and the superintendent to have a heads up about them, so we can be prepared and make sure questions are addressed, but certainly any major changes you want to see to the policy, that we're prepared for those. And I would think we'll have more of an opportunity to do this at our next meeting, but I just want to acknowledge the tremendous amount of work that's gone into getting us here, more than a year of work and a huge effort. Mr. Rodriguez as chair of the policy committee, Mr. Townsend as the staff person leading that work, and the superintendent and many others have been involved in this work. And it involved some great input and from the community, especially coming out of the SRO conversation. So I know we'll have more of an opportunity to appreciate that work and speak to it at our next meeting, but I do want to just acknowledge that before we close tonight. So I think that's it for tonight. That closes out our workshop. Thank you so much, everyone, and good evening. Hope you get some sleep.